Hello everyone! Welcome to week 2 of the White Christmas Dress Sew Along. We are using the 1950s Sisters Dress pattern by Edelweiss Patterns, which is inspired by the classic blue white Christmas dresses. Last week we constructed the skirt and skirt overlay, and today we are going to make the foundation bodice, which is really when you start to get an idea of what this dress is going to look like. In case you missed week 1 of the sew along, I will link it in the description below, and the pattern is available at www.edelweisspatterns.com. So let's get started. For the foundation bodice, you will need 4 pieces: the bodice front, bodice side front, bodice back, and bodice side back. Following the yardage layout, we're going to cut out 4 of each except for piece number 1, which is cut on the fold, and that one only needs 2 cut out. This dress I'm wearing, by the way, is made from an antique 1950s Bodice pattern. I think we have this mental image that all women in the 1950s wore huge bouffant petticoats every single day, and when you read fashion magazines from the era, you see that actually wasn't true. But yes, this dress is 100% accurate to the time period. You will notice I have folded the fabric widthwise to speed up the process. It's just faster to cut out everything at once, rather than having to lay out, pin, and cut twice. Now I am going to clip through all the notches before I remove any pattern pieces. I found that doing all the notches right up front makes your project go faster and gives you more peace of mind that you won't forget them later on. Once I have everything cut out, I am sitting down at my machine to put those E-stitches into the bodice side front. So you can put a row of E-stitching along the entire curved edge of the bodice side front. I am choosing to only put the E-stitching between the 2 notches. I'm sewing the C through D cup size, so I really want to concentrate the fullness between the notches for a good fit. Now I'm pinning and stitching those bodice side fronts that I just finished into the bodice front piece, maneuvering carefully around the curves as I don't want any puckering. And all seam allowances in this pattern are the standard 5/8 of an inch. Once these seams are finished, I need to notch the curves before pressing. This will help the seam lay properly and make for a professional look on the outside. So I'm chopping out triangular shapes in the curved portion of the seam only, and then I'm going to take my scissors and trim the entire seam allowance down to around 3/8 of an inch. Now this next part will take very careful pressing. You will need a tailor's ham to press the curves, but don't worry, most of the remaining seams will be very easy after this one. So first, I press the seams flat as you would with a standard seam. Next, I'm opening up the seam and placing it over the tailor's ham, and then I'm going to press a little bit at a time, making sure the seam is completely open before I press and steam. You don't want to press the entire seam in one long stroke, or you will get wrinkles in the curved portion steamed into the fabric. Once both princess seams have been pressed open, you can set this part aside and move on to the back bodice assembly. Working with pieces 3 and 4, I'm going to pin the bodice back and the bodice side back together, matching the notches exactly. So these seams are a cinch. I'm just whizzing through all of them, 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to trim the seam allowances down to 3/8 of an inch. Now these seams are also very straightforward to press. I'm just pressing them flat, pressing them open, and then pressing them to one side. With those finished, it's time to attach the bodice front to the bodice back. Lay out the bodice front with the right side up and lay the bodice backs on top with the right sides together. I'm pressing these seams flat, pressing them open, and finally pressing them towards the back. Now repeat this entire process for the second bodice until you have 2 completed foundation bodices with all seam allowances pressed and trimmed. And this is where it all comes together. I'm placing my 2 finished bodices right sides together and pinning along the neckline edge. Now I'm going to carefully stitch this seam, taking my time around the curves, as the neckline will play a prominent role in the finished look of the dress. I'm going to pivot at the center front V of the neckline to get a crisp and clean look on the outside. It's very important to clip about halfway through the seam allowance at the center front so the garment lays flat. And then I'm taking the rest of the seam allowances down to that 3/8 inch mark. And it's time to press this final bodice seam. First, I'm laying the garment flat and pressing it well. Next, I'm opening this seam up as I want to press it open. Those seams are all matched up perfectly and it's going to be beautiful once it's pressed. I'm placing the neckline seam on my wooden point presser, which works very well for tricky to get at areas such as this one. Once that whole seam is pressed open, lay the garment flat on your ironing board or table so you can pin the seam allowances to one side of the bodice. Now I'm making sure that the seam is completely open as I pin the seam allowances down. If you leave any slack in the seam, you're going to end up with extra fabric stitched into this next row of stitching, and one bodice will end up shorter than the other. So you definitely don't want that to happen, so be sure everything is pulled taut as you pin for the understitching. Back at my machine, I have the bodice open with the wrong sides facing me, and I'm going to stitch very close to the seam, following the lines of the neckline and keeping the fabric taut on both sides so there's no bunching underneath. You'll want to maneuver carefully around the center front dip, but you can absolutely do it and it will look very professional. With the understitching finished, you can fold the bodice back to right side out, leaving all those neatly pressed seams on the inside. And finally, I'm pressing on the outside of the garment along the neckline edge to get a good crisp finish. And the foundation bodice is done! So you can set this bodice aside now, and next week we will be sewing the lace overlay bodice and assembling it with the foundation bodice we created today. If you missed week 1 of the sew along, I will link that below, and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss when a new video is uploaded. I'd like to thank you all for joining me today, and I will see you next week here on the Edelweiss Patterns YouTube channel.